Hello and welcome to our very first computer side chat, where today we will be introducing the concept of government. What is it? Why do we have it? And how do we define the territory within which government can use its power? So without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So let's answer that main question first. What is government? Well, government is the institution through which a society makes and enforces public policy. And to answer the follow-up question that comes with that definition, public policy is the things government decides to do within its own borders. So public policy, once again, is the things government decides to do within its own borders. So to combine those two definitions, government is the institution that decides what will happen within a country and then enforces those rules and laws. Now, to do this, government has three different kinds of powers, and you've probably heard of these before. Those three different kinds of powers are legislative, executive, and judicial. So legislative power means that the government has the power to make laws. So the government can pass a law that says that you're not allowed to steal. Executive power says that government has the power to then enforce those laws. So the government has the right to, if you steal, enforce the law that you're not allowed to do that and hit you with some kind of punishment for breaking the law. And then lastly, the judicial branch interprets the laws. And so what that means is they take the laws and they interpret them within the confines of our Constitution. So was a law passed? Did it violate the Constitution somehow? Did the way a law was enforced, does that violate the Constitution somehow? So that's what we mean when we say the judicial branch interprets the law. We'll get more into constitutional rights and interpretation, as well as how we decide what is unconstitutional and what is not, more when we get to the constitutional unit of this course. So government acts and uses these three powers within what is called a state. Now, you're probably familiar with this term already as you live in the state of Ohio, but when we talk about government or we talk about political science, this idea of a state is used more broadly. So, for example, the United States is also a state. So a state is just a body of people within a defined territory with the power to create and enforce laws. So in other words, if we have a defined territory, if there are people that live within that territory, and if they have the ability to make and enforce their own laws, we consider that to be a state. So the United States is a state because it checks all of those boxes. Ohio is also a state because it once again checks all of those boxes. The four characteristics of a state are kind of basically what I just said. Does it have a population? In other words, do people live there? Does it have a defined territory? So are there borders that define clearly what the area of this state is? Does it have sovereignty? And we'll come back to that in a second. And does it have a functioning government? So those are the four characteristics of a state. You have to meet all four of those characteristics to be considered a state. So what does this mean, sovereignty? Well, sovereignty is a state's supreme and ultimate power to define policy within the confines of its territory. To put that a bit more simply, a sovereign state controls itself. It doesn't depend on some outside power to make rules for them. So the United States is a sovereign state. It is a sovereign power. It was not a sovereign power when it was a British colony. Britain set the rules for the 13 original colonies. They set the laws. And while the colonies did have some levels of self-control and self-government, ultimately it was up to Britain what could and could not be done in the colonies. So the 13 original American colonies were not considered sovereign. Once we broke away from Britain and declared our independence and declared ourselves the United States of America, we were essentially declaring ourselves a sovereign state. So how do sovereign states come about? And more specifically, how do governments come about? Because we already said to be a state, you have to have some form of government. And government doesn't just appear out of thin air. So how does government develop? Where does it come from? This has been a huge question in political science since basically the dawn of civilization. How does one gain power? How does one come to power? And how does one use that power? And so we're going to talk now about some of those theories of how government comes about. The oldest and kind of first theory of how government comes about is the evolutionary theory. And the evolutionary theory basically states that government has evolved from the family. In other words, the head of the family, the father, kind of runs things, sets the rules, is in charge of the family, and kind of makes the ultimate decisions. So the evolutionary theory says that government evolved from this, that essentially government mirrored the family with its own head at the top that ultimately makes decisions, enforces the rules, so on and so forth. The second theory of how government comes about is what is known as force theory. And that basically means that government happens when people are united under a person or group who has control over them, usually through force. So one of the classic examples of a government being established through force theory is the old Roman Empire. A power that extended throughout Europe, into Africa, and eventually conquering the entire Mediterranean, didn't do so by asking people nicely. They took that territory by force, and they maintained that empire by force. Next theory we have is the divine right theory. And this simply says that leaders are chosen by God. So a king or a queen is not just someone that was born into that position. They were literally God's own chosen person to lead their country. This theory has been around again for centuries, going back to ancient times. Now, the last theory of government is the most important to us because it is the theory of government behind the creation of the United States. It's the theory in which our government and our Constitution was built around, and that is the social contract theory. And the social contract theory states that people give up some rights to the government in exchange for protection. We'll get into the more specific details of that later, but that's really the only general definition you need of the social contract right now. Now, this idea originated during the Enlightenment, and so you might remember this from your freshman world history class. Just as a review, the Enlightenment was a time where ideas about democracy became more and more popular. So people stopped believing in monarchies and dictatorships and started asking the questions of why don't people have more of a role in government and the decisions that government make. The major theorists behind this were Rousseau, Hobbes, and Locke. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about them in class later this week. But essentially, they came up with this idea of a two-way street. And what that means is citizens have to give up their rights if they want to be protected by a government. You can't have everything you want. You can't have total freedom or what would be known as anarchy, and also have a government that is there to protect you. It's not possible. You have to give things up in some way if you want to have a bigger, larger, more powerful body that is there to protect you and ensure your safety. We'll get more into social contract, like I said, later in this week. But we are going to conclude our discussion today by talking about the four basic purposes of government. Now, the things that government isn't necessarily limited to these four things. But in a general sense, they have to in some way be able to accomplish these four things. So the first thing they have to do is maintain order. And that very simply means that they have to ensure that those living within a community have a peaceful and safe environment. So in other words, when you come to school every day, it's the job of the government to ensure that you can get there safely. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that bad things don't happen, that people aren't victims of crime, but the government has to try and minimize those things. They have to offer you some protection and safety to ensure that you don't live in a chaotic society. Number 2, government is in charge of providing public services. In other words, government has to provide you the things that make living within a community possible. You attend one of those things every day. A public service that government provides is public education. They also provide things like roads, police, fire stations, hospitals, so on and so forth. In other words, they have to provide things that help you, that ensure that society can be successful and the people within it are given all the tools that they need to be successful as well. Third is government will provide national security, and that just means that they'll protect you from outside threats. So when you hear discussions in the news about national security, and when we make this decision or that decision on foreign policy, does it protect us? Does it ensure our national security? What that means is, do the decisions that our government are making, does it make sure that we are safe from terrorists, foreign nations, whatever it may be, coming in and harming us? And lastly, government is in charge of making economic decisions. And that means they control the economy and they make decisions concerning money. The most hated decision they make concerning money is taxes. How much you pay in taxes, what that tax money goes towards, so on and so forth. Economics is going to be something we spend the entire fourth quarter on. We're not going to get into it a whole lot in class for these first 3 quarters. We might have a short discussion on what is capitalism, what is socialism, what is communism, so on and so forth, before you get launched into your first group project. But we're not going to have really big discussions on economics and the things that government does when it comes to economics until we get to the fourth quarter. So that brings this first computer sci chat to a conclusion. Hopefully you were able to follow along. If not, rewind it, go back, find what you need to, and make sure you got all the notes that you should have. From here, what you need to do is you need to go to Schoology, find Computer Sci Chat number 1 quiz, and that should be under the Unit 1 folder, and you need to take that. So good luck with that. That shouldn't take you too long. Have a great night, and I will see you in class tomorrow.